They laughed as they shaved her head. Two county jail officers stood over a handcuffed black woman in a concrete intake room, electric clippers buzzing, phones recording, mocking every stroke as her hair fell to the floor. They treated her dignity like a punchline, her protests like background noise. She sat perfectly still, eyes forward, and said only one thing. "You're making a mistake you'll never recover from." They laughed harder. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that by morning, those same laughing faces would be frozen in courtroom silence, staring up at the bench where she belonged. If you want to see how power, cruelty, and justice collide in ways no one saw coming, stay until the end, and drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most Saturdays did for Ava Brooks, quiet, measured, and hers. She laced up her running shoes in the pre-dawn stillness of her townhouse, double-knotted them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned long ago that preparation mattered more than speed. The air outside was cool and clean, the kind of early spring morning that made the city feel almost forgiving. She stretched briefly on her front steps, rolled her shoulders, and started her usual route through the park that bordered the historic district. Ava ran alone. Always had. It wasn't about fitness, though at 47 she moved with the easy endurance of someone half her age. It was about clarity, about the rare luxury of existing in her own body, in her own thoughts, without the weight of a robe, a gavel, or the eyes of a courtroom full of people waiting for her next word. For 2 hours every Saturday, she wasn't Judge Ava Brooks of the 7th District Court. She was just Ava, a woman with music in her ears and sweat on her brow, and no one asking her to decide someone else's fate. She rounded the corner past the fountain, her pace steady, her breathing even. The park was nearly empty, just a handful of early joggers and a couple walking their dog. Ava liked it this way. Peaceful. Predictable. That peace shattered in less than 60 seconds. A block ahead, near the intersection of Maple and 5th, she saw the crowd first. Dozens of people pressed together, voices rising in a jagged chorus of anger and defiance. Signs. Bullhorns. The unmistakable tension of a protest on the edge of something darker. Police cruisers lined the street, their lights flashing in silent warning. Officers stood in formation, shields raised, batons ready. Ava slowed, instinct kicking in. She'd been a lawyer long before she became a judge. She knew how quickly situations like this could spiral. She veered left, intending to loop around the block and head home, but the crowd surged suddenly. Someone shoved from behind, people stumbling forward, voices shouting, and before she could fully register what was happening, she was caught in the wave. "Move back! Everybody move back!" An officer bellowed through a megaphone, his voice distorted and furious. Ava tried. She turned, arms up, signaling she wasn't part of it, but the crowd pressed tighter. Someone's elbow hit her shoulder. Another body slammed into her side. She stumbled, caught herself, and tried to push toward the edge of the chaos. That's when she saw the line break. Officers rushed forward, batons swinging, hands grabbing. People screamed, someone fell. Ava backed up fast, but not fast enough. A hand clamped down on her arm, rough, unyielding. "You're under arrest," a voice barked. Ava's head whipped around. The officer was young, maybe late 20s, with a square jaw and eyes that didn't bother to see her. Just another body in the crowd. Another problem to contain. "I'm not part of this," Ava said, her voice calm but firm. "I was jogging. I got caught in—" "Save it!" He twisted her arm behind her back and she felt the cold bite of metal as the cuffs clicked tight around her wrists. "You can explain it downtown." "Listen to me," Ava said, her voice sharpening. "I'm not resisting. I'm telling you I wasn't involved. Lady, I don't care if you're the mayor. You're in the middle of an unlawful assembly. Let's go." He shoved her forward, and Ava's jaw tightened. She didn't struggle, didn't shout, didn't give him a reason to make it worse. She'd seen too many cases where resistance, real or imagined, became the excuse for violence. So she walked, cuffed and silent, as he guided her toward a transport van idling at the curb. Inside, the van was already half full. A mix of protesters, mostly young, mostly angry, mostly scared. A couple of them glanced at Ava, taking in her jogging clothes, her silver-streaked hair tied back in a ponytail, the calm set of her face. She didn't look like she belonged. But then again, none of them did. The doors slammed shut, the engine rumbled, and Ava closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly, deliberately, even as her mind raced ahead to what came next. She knew the system. She was the system. And she knew that the next few hours were going to be a test of everything she'd ever stood for. The county jail intake facility was exactly as grim as she remembered from the handful of times she'd toured it years ago during her early tenure. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The air smelled like disinfectant and sweat and something else, something sour and resigned that came from too many people passing through too many times. Ava was processed in silence. Name, address, reason for arrest. She answered each question with the same measured calm she brought to the bench, even as the officer behind the desk barely looked at her, typing with 2 fingers and chewing gum like this was the most boring Saturday shift of his life. "Any medical conditions?" he asked, not looking up. "No." "Allergies?" "No." "You got somebody we can call?" Ava paused. She could call her clerk, her bailiff. Hell, she could call the district attorney's office directly and be out in under an hour. But something stopped her. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the cold certainty that if she intervened now, she'd never see how this place really worked when no one thought anyone important was watching. "No," she said. The officer shrugged. "Suit yourself. Next." She was moved to a holding cell with 3 other women, 2 young, 1 older, all wearing the same exhausted expression of people who'd been through this before. Ava sat on the metal bench, hands folded in her lap, and waited. An hour passed. Then another. No one came. No one explained what was happening. The women around her talked in low voices, about bail, about lawyers, about kids they needed to get home to. Ava listened, her mind cataloging every delay, every procedural corner cut, every dignity denied. Finally, the door clanged open. "Brooks, you're up." Ava stood, followed the officer down a narrow hallway and into a small windowless room. A desk, 2 chairs, a camera mounted in the corner, and 2 officers waiting for her, both men, both white, both looking at her with the kind of casual disdain that made her stomach tighten. The taller one leaned against the desk, arms crossed. His name tag read Turner. The other, shorter and stockier, stood by the door. His badge said Ellis. "Have a seat," Turner said, nodding toward the chair. Ava sat. Turner picked up a clipboard, glanced at it, then looked at her with a faint smirk. "So, Ava Brooks, says here you were arrested during an unlawful assembly, resisting arrest, failure to comply with lawful orders." "That's incorrect," Ava said evenly. "I wasn't part of the protest. I was jogging. I got caught in the crowd and tried to leave. I didn't resist anything." Turner raised an eyebrow. "That's not what the arresting officer says." "Then the arresting officer is mistaken." Ellis chuckled from the doorway. "They always are, right?" Ava turned her gaze to him, her expression unreadable. "I'm telling you what happened." "Sure you are," Turner said, still smiling. He tossed the clipboard onto the desk. "Here's the thing, though. You don't really get to tell us what happened. We've got a report. We've got witnesses. We've got you in cuffs. So what you think happened doesn't really matter." Ava's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Turner leaned forward, his smile widening. "You know what I think? I think you were out there causing trouble just like the rest of them. And now you're trying to play the victim. Act like you're too good for all this." He gestured around the room. "But you're not. You're here, just like everybody else." Ava met his eyes, held them. "Are we finished?" "Not quite," Turner said. He straightened, exchanged a glance with Ellis, and then turned back to her. "See, there's one more thing we got to take care of before you go back to holding." "And what's that?" Turner's grin turned sharp. "Contraband check." Ava frowned. "I've already been searched." "Not thoroughly enough," Ellis said from the door, his tone almost cheerful. Ava's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Turner said slowly, "that you've got something hidden. And we're going to find it." "I don't." "Then you won't mind if we make sure." Ava's mind raced. She knew the law, knew her rights, knew that what they were implying wasn't standard procedure, not without cause, not without a female officer present, not without proper protocol. But she also knew that objecting too loudly, too forcefully, could escalate this into something far worse. "I want a female officer present," she said clearly. Turner laughed. "Yeah, well, she's on break. Guess you're stuck with us." "Then I'm refusing the search until she's available." Turner's smile vanished. "You're refusing?" "That's correct." Ellis pushed off the door, stepping closer. "Lady, you don't get to refuse." "Actually," Ava said, her voice colder now, "I do. And if you proceed without following proper procedure, anything you claim to find will be inadmissible, and you'll be opening yourselves up to a lawsuit you won't win." Turner's face darkened. "You a lawyer or something?" "Or something." He stared at her for a long moment, and Ava could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He didn't like being challenged, didn't like her calm, didn't like the fact that she wasn't afraid. "Fine," he said finally. "No search. But you're going to sit here and wait until we're damn good and ready to move you. Understood?" "Understood." Turner jerked his head toward the door. "Ellis, let's go." They left. The door slammed shut, and Ava sat alone in the little room, her hands still cuffed, her heart pounding against her ribs. She closed her eyes, breathed. "They don't know who I am," she thought, and that might be the most dangerous thing of all. Another hour passed before the door opened again. This time it was Ellis, alone. He didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. "Turner's pissed," he said. Ava said nothing. Ellis moved closer, leaning against the desk. "You know, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm following the law." "Yeah?" He smirked. "Well, the law doesn't do you much good in here." Ava met his eyes. "It will." Ellis's smirk faded. He studied her for a moment, then shook his head. "You really think you're special, don't you?" "I think I'm a citizen with rights." "Rights." He laughed bitterly. "Lady, you lost those the second you got arrested. In here, you're just another body, another number, and the sooner you figure that out, the easier this'll be." Ava leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "Is there a point to this conversation?" Ellis straightened. "Yeah, the point is you need to watch your mouth. Because Turner, he's got a mean streak, and if you keep pushing him, he's going to push back, hard." "I'll take my chances." Ellis stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, glancing back. "Your funeral," he said, and then he was gone. They came for her again at shift change. Ava had been moved back to holding, where she'd spent the last 3 hours sitting on a metal bench surrounded by women who'd stopped asking questions and started accepting silence. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Someone coughed. Someone else cried softly in the corner. When the door finally opened, it wasn't Ellis or Turner. It was a female officer, mid-30s, black, with tired eyes and a no-nonsense expression. "Brooks," she said, "come with me." Ava stood, followed her down a different hallway, through a set of double doors, and into what looked like a processing area. Benches, lockers, a sink, and standing near the back wall, arms crossed, was Turner. Ava's stomach dropped. "Took you long enough," Turner said to the female officer. She ignored him. "Sit," she told Ava, gesturing to a bench. Ava sat. The officer knelt down, unlocked Ava's cuffs, and stepped back. "Stay still." Ava nodded. Turner moved closer, a plastic bag in one hand. "All right, let's get this over with." The female officer frowned. "What are you doing?" "Contraband check," Turner said casually. "We got a tip she's hiding something." "From who?" "Anonymous." The officer's frown deepened. "That's not protocol." "It is now." Ava's pulse quickened. She looked at the female officer, saw the hesitation in her eyes, the way she glanced at Turner and then back at Ava. And in that moment, Ava realized something crucial. This woman didn't want to be here, didn't want to be part of whatever Turner was planning, but she wasn't going to stop him either. I want this on record, Ava said clearly. I'm not consenting to this search. Turner grinned. Noted. He reached into the bag and pulled out a pair of electric clippers. Ava went cold. What are you doing? She asked, her voice sharp. Making sure you're not hiding anything, Turner said. He turned on the clippers. They buzzed to life, loud and mechanical. The female officer stepped back. Turner, this isn't... Shut up, Turner snapped. He looked at Ava. Stand up. Ava didn't move. I said stand up. I'm not going to... Turner grabbed her arm and yanked her to her feet. Ava twisted, trying to pull away, but his grip was iron. Ellis appeared from somewhere behind her, grabbing her other arm, and suddenly she was pinned between them, her body rigid, her mind screaming. Hold still, Turner said, his voice low and cruel. And then he pressed the clippers to her scalp. The first pass was brutal. Ava felt the teeth dig in, felt her hair pull, and then release, falling in dark clumps to the floor. She tried to jerk away, but Ellis held her fast, his fingers digging into her shoulders. Stop, Ava said, her voice breaking. Stop! Turner laughed. What's the matter? Thought you were too good for this? Another pass, more hair. She could see it on the floor now, scattered and lifeless, her vision blurred. Not from tears, she wouldn't give them that, but from sheer, searing rage. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice shaking. You're making a mistake you'll never recover from. Turner paused, the clipper still buzzing near her ear. Is that a threat? It's a promise. He laughed again, loud, mocking. Ellis joined in, his breath hot against the back of her neck. And somewhere in the background the female officer stood frozen, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. The clippers moved again, and again, and again. When it was over, Ava stood there, trembling, her scalp bare and raw, her jogging clothes dusted with hair, her dignity stripped down to nothing. Turner stepped back, admiring his work. There, much better. He pulled out his phone, snapped a picture, and showed it to Ellis. They both laughed. Ava didn't look at them, didn't speak. She stared straight ahead, her jaw locked, her fists clenched so tight her nails bit into her palms. Take her back to holding, Turner said, still grinning, and make sure everybody gets a good look. Ellis grabbed her arm again, but this time Ava didn't resist. She let him guide her out of the room, down the hallway, past officers and inmates and people who stared and whispered and looked away. When they finally threw her back into the holding cell, she sat down on the bench, folded her hands in her lap, and closed her eyes. And deep in the pocket of her jogging jacket, hidden, silent, and still recording, her phone captured every word, every laugh, every second of what they'd done. Tomorrow morning, she thought, her heart steady now, her mind clear. Tomorrow morning, they'll understand. But tonight, in the cold fluorescent light of a county jail, surrounded by women who'd seen too much and expected too little, Judge Ava Brooks sat in silence. The night stretched on in fractured increments, minutes that felt like hours, hours that collapsed into moments. Ava sat motionless on the metal bench, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Around her, the other women in the holding cell had long since stopped trying to make conversation. They'd learned what she already knew. In places like this, silence was safer than questions. But Ava wasn't silent inside. Her mind moved with the precision of a machine that had never stopped running. She cataloged every detail, every face, every procedural violation, Turner's badge number, Ellis's smirk, the female officer's name tag, Rodriguez, and the way she'd looked away when it mattered most. The camera in the corner of that processing room, its red light blinking steadily throughout the entire ordeal. And the phone, still tucked deep in the inner pocket of her running jacket, right where she'd zipped it before her jog. Still recording, still capturing every word, every laugh, every second of humiliation they'd inflicted with such casual cruelty. Ava had activated the voice memo app that morning out of habit. She often recorded notes to herself during runs, reminders about cases or ideas that struck her mid-stride. She'd forgotten to turn it off before the arrest. That small oversight, that tiny stroke of fortune, had just become the most important piece of evidence she'd ever possessed. She didn't touch the phone, didn't check it, didn't risk drawing attention to it during any of the searches, cursory as they'd been despite Turner's threats. They'd patted her down, emptied her pockets of keys and wallet, but they'd missed the inner zipper, missed the one thing that would destroy them. A door clanged somewhere in the distance. Footsteps echoed. Someone shouted for a medic. The fluorescent lights buzzed and flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Ava closed her eyes and let herself remember what Turner and Ellis didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know. At 9 o'clock Monday morning, less than 40 hours from now, she was scheduled to take the bench in Courtroom 7B. The case was a high-profile internal affairs matter that had been building for 18 months. 3 officers from this very facility facing multiple counts of civil rights violations, excessive force, falsification of records, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Officers who'd brutalized inmates, planted evidence, and covered for each other with such systematic precision that it had taken a federal investigation to crack the wall of silence. The lead defendants were Officer Marcus Turner and Officer Daniel Ellis. The preliminary hearings had been contentious. Their defense attorney, a sharp, expensive lawyer named Keller, who specialized in defending dirty cops, had filed motion after motion trying to get the case dismissed, the evidence suppressed, the witnesses discredited. But Ava had denied them all. She'd read every deposition, watched every surveillance video, studied every pattern of abuse that stretched back 7 years. She knew Turner's record, knew about the complaint from 2019 where he'd allegedly forced a female inmate to strip in front of male officers, knew about the 2021 incident where Ellis had been accused of breaking a man's arm during intake and then documenting it as resisting arrest, knew about the dozen other complaints that had been buried, ignored, or resolved internally before the feds finally stepped in. And now, through some dark twist of fate, she'd become their latest victim. Except this time, they'd made a critical error. This time, they'd chosen the wrong person to humiliate, the wrong person to underestimate, the wrong person to shave bald and mock and document with their phones like it was all just another Saturday night joke. Ava opened her eyes, looked down at her hands. They were steady, calmer than they'd been hours ago when Turner's clippers had first touched her scalp. The rage was still there, burning, absolute, but it was focused now, refined into something far more dangerous than anger, purpose. A female officer Ava hadn't seen before appeared at the cell door, keys jangling. "Brooks, you made bail." The other women looked up, surprised. Ava stood slowly, her body stiff from hours of sitting on metal. "Who posted it?" she asked. The officer shrugged. "Doesn't say. Just says you're released on your own recognizance. Lucky you." Ava said nothing. She walked to the door, waited while the officer unlocked it, and followed her down the corridor toward processing. The facility was quieter now, the late-night lull between shifts when even the most hardened corrections officers moved a little slower, talked a little less. At the property desk, a board clerk pushed a manila envelope toward her. "Sign here." Ava signed, took the envelope. Inside were her keys, her wallet, her ID. Everything except her dignity, which Turner and Ellis had tried to take with a pair of clippers and a camera phone. "You're all set," the clerk said without looking up. "Exits that way." Ava walked toward the double doors that led to freedom, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Just before she reached them, she turned and looked back at the facility, at the cameras mounted in every corner, at the locked doors and barred windows, and the institutional gray that seemed to seep into everything. She thought about the women still in holding, the ones who didn't have law degrees or judicial robes or the ability to fight back against a system designed to grind them down, the ones who'd been humiliated just like her, but who'd never see justice because no one believed them, no one recorded it, no one cared. Ava pushed through the doors and stepped into the cool pre-dawn air. By the time she reached her townhouse 20 minutes later, having called a rideshare with borrowed phone access, the sky was beginning to lighten. She unlocked her door, stepped inside, and locked it behind her. The familiar quiet of her home settled around her like a blanket. She walked directly to her bedroom, pulled the phone from her jacket pocket, and checked it. Still recording, battery at 38%. She stopped the recording, plugged the phone into her charger, and backed up the audio file to 3 separate cloud accounts. Only then did she allow herself to walk to the bathroom and look in the mirror. The woman staring back at her was both stranger and self. Her scalp was uneven, raw in places where the clippers had been pressed too hard, nicked in others where they'd been wielded with careless violence. Her eyes were bloodshot from hours under fluorescent lights. Her jaw was tight, but her gaze was clear. Ava reached up and touched her bare head, felt the vulnerability of it, the violation. And then she lowered her hand and straightened her shoulders. "They're going to learn," she said quietly to her reflection. "They're going to learn exactly who they humiliated." She showered, changed into clean clothes, made coffee, and then she sat down at her dining room table with her laptop, her phone, and a legal pad, and began to work. The first call went to her clerk, Michael Chen, a brilliant young lawyer who'd clerked for her for 3 years and knew her methods better than anyone. His phone rang 4 times before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. "Judge Brooks? Michael, I need you to meet me at Chambers in 2 hours." There was a pause. "It's Sunday morning." "I'm aware. 2 hours. Bring the Turner Ellis case file, all of it, every exhibit, every motion, every piece of evidence. Is everything okay?" "No," Ava said calmly. "But it will be. 2 hours." She hung up before he could ask more questions. The second call went to Sarah Reeves, the federal prosecutor handling the case against Turner and Ellis. Sarah was in her early 40s, a former public defender who'd switched sides after watching too many of her clients brutalized by the very people sworn to protect them. She answered on the second ring. "Ava, it's 6 in the morning. I know, I need to see you, today, as soon as possible." Sarah's voice sharpened. "What happened?" "I'll explain when I see you. Can you meet me at my chambers at 8:30? "Of course, but Ava, 8:30, Sarah, and bring your media contact at the Justice Department. I think they're going to want to hear this." Ava ended the call, made 3 more, to her bailiff, to the court administrator, to a forensic audio analyst she'd worked with on previous cases. Each conversation was brief, precise, and left no room for questions she wasn't ready to answer yet. By the time she finished, sunlight was streaming through her kitchen windows. She poured herself a second cup of coffee, opened her laptop, and began drafting the motion that would change everything. At 8:15, Ava walked into her chambers wearing a dark gray suit, low heels, and a silk scarf wrapped elegantly around her head. The scarf was burgundy, rich, dignified, deliberate. It covered the damage but didn't hide the fact that something had happened. Michael was already waiting, the Turner Ellis files spread across the conference table, his expression tight with worry. "Judge Brooks, what?" She held up a hand. "Wait for Sarah." He fell silent, studied her face, saw something there that made him sit down without another word. Sarah arrived 10 minutes later, accompanied by a tall woman in a sharp black suit who introduced herself as Marion Clark, Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Civil Rights Division. They both looked at Ava with the kind of careful assessment that lawyers reserve for witnesses who might be about to change a case. "Thank you for coming," Ava said. She gestured to the conference table. "Please, sit." They sat. Ava remained standing, her hands resting on the back of a chair, her gaze moving from face to face. "Yesterday morning," she began, "I went for a run. I was arrested during a protest crackdown, taken to county intake. And over the course of 14 hours, I was processed, held, and subjected to what can only be described as deliberate, systematic humiliation by 2 officers whose case I am scheduled to hear tomorrow morning." Sarah's face went pale. "Who?" "Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis." Marion Clark leaned forward. "Did they know who you were?" "No, not until after." "After what?" Michael asked quietly. Ava unwrapped the scarf. The room went silent. Michael's hand went to his mouth. Sarah closed her eyes briefly. Marion Clark's expression hardened into something cold and professional and absolutely furious. "They did this to you," Sarah said, her voice shaking, "knowing you're presiding over their case." "They didn't know at the time," Ava corrected, "but they do now." Marion pulled out a tablet, began typing rapidly. "We need a full statement, timeline, witnesses, any documentation." "I have documentation," Ava said. She pulled her phone from her pocket, connected it to the conference room's audio system, and played the recording. For the next 7 minutes, no one moved. They listened to her arrest, her processing, her calm requests for proper procedure. They listened to Turner's mockery, Ellis's threats, Rodriguez's silence. And they listened to the clippers, the buzz of the motor, the sound of hair hitting the floor, the laughter. When it ended, the silence was absolute. Sarah spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. This is prosecutable. Federal civil rights charges. This is exactly the pattern we've been documenting. It's more than that, Marion said. She looked at Ava, and there was something almost like admiration in her eyes. This is the case that breaks them. A sitting judge arrested by chance, humiliated by the same officers she's about to sentence for doing exactly this to other people. The irony is almost too perfect. It's not irony, Ava said quietly. It's proof. Proof that what they did to me, they've done to dozens of others. Proof that their contempt for human dignity isn't personal, it's systemic. And proof that when they think no one is watching, when they think their victim is powerless, they reveal exactly who they are. Michael was staring at the phone like it was a bomb. Judge Brooks, if you use this recording, you're going to become the story. Every media outlet in the country is going to run with this. Your face, your name, your... He gestured helplessly at her head. Everything. I know. And Turner and Ellis will claim you orchestrated it, that you set them up, that this is judicial bias. Let them claim it. The recording is time-stamped. The arrest report is public record. Every procedural violation is documented. And when Sarah adds this to the existing evidence of their pattern of abuse, it won't matter what they claim. The truth will be undeniable. Marion stood, began pacing. We'll need to move fast. File the new charges immediately. Request emergency seizure of their phones. If they photographed you, that's additional evidence. Pull surveillance footage from the facility. Interview Rodriguez and any other witnesses. And we'll need to coordinate with the media carefully. Frame this correctly from the start. What about the trial? Michael asked. Judge Brooks, you can't preside over their case now. You're a victim. You're a witness. The defense will demand recusal. They will, Ava agreed. And I'll grant it. Judge Hartman can take over. He's already familiar with the case. She paused. But before I recuse myself, I'm going to make sure the record is absolutely clear about why. I'm going to detail every procedural violation, every act of misconduct, every piece of evidence that demonstrates Turner and Ellis are exactly what the prosecution has claimed all along. And then I'm going to step aside and let justice proceed. Sarah was nodding slowly, her lawyer's mind already working through strategy. This changes everything. Every defense motion we've been fighting. Suddenly they're irrelevant. Keller can't argue that Turner and Ellis are good officers who've been unfairly targeted when his clients just brutalized a sitting judge. He can't claim the pattern evidence is circumstantial when they literally repeated that pattern on you. Exactly, Ava said, which is why we need to act immediately, before they have time to coordinate a defense, before evidence disappears, before anyone can claim this was anything other than what it was. Two officers drunk on power, humiliating someone they thought was powerless, and getting caught because they never imagined there would be consequences. Marion stopped pacing. I'm calling the director. This goes all the way up. Federal charges, civil rights violations, abuse of authority under color of law, and we're going to push for the maximum on every count. She looked at Ava. Judge Brooks, I need you to understand what you're about to step into. This is going to be brutal. They're going to dig into your life, your career, your decisions. They're going to try to paint you as vindictive, as someone who orchestrated this for revenge. Are you prepared for that? Ava met her gaze without flinching. Ms. Clark, I've been a black woman in the legal system for 25 years. I've been underestimated, dismissed, and challenged every single day of my career. I've had lawyers question my competence, defendants curse at me, and colleagues suggest I only got appointed because of affirmative action. So yes, I'm prepared. The corner of Marion's mouth lifted slightly. Good, because we're about to make this the most high-profile civil rights case of the decade. For the next 3 hours, they worked. Michael drafted the recusal motion while Sarah prepared the supplemental criminal complaint. Marion coordinated with the Justice Department, arranged for forensic examination of Ava's phone, and scheduled a press conference for Monday afternoon. Ava gave her formal statement, detailed every moment, answered every question with the same calm precision she brought to the bench. By noon, the machinery of justice was in motion, grinding, inevitable, and aimed directly at Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis. At 1:30, Ava's phone rang. Unknown number, she answered. Judge Brooks? The voice was male, unfamiliar, tight with barely controlled panic. Who is this? This is Captain Raymond Foster, Supervisor of Corrections at County Intake. Judge Brooks, I just learned about what happened yesterday, and I need you to understand that I had no knowledge, no awareness that you were in our facility, and if I had known... Captain Foster, Ava interrupted, her voice cool. Are you calling to apologize or to cover yourself? Silence. Because if it's the latter, Ava continued, you should know that I've already provided a full statement to federal prosecutors, including details about the lack of supervision, the absence of proper protocol, and the failure of your staff to intervene when 2 officers under investigation for civil rights violations decided to humiliate an inmate in your custody. Judge Brooks, please. You have surveillance footage of everything that happened. I suggest you preserve it immediately and turn it over to the federal investigators who will be contacting you within the hour. Do you understand? Yes. Yes, I understand. Good. And Captain Foster, you might want to review the employment files of Officers Turner and Ellis, specifically the complaints that were never properly investigated, because when this goes to trial, those files are going to be entered into evidence, and you're going to have to explain under oath why those men were still wearing badges. She hung up before he could respond. Michael looked up from his laptop. That was cold. That was necessary, Ava corrected. She stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the courthouse plaza below. People were going about their Sunday, families with children, couples with dogs, joggers like she'd been just yesterday morning. Normal life, proceeding as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. But it had. And by tomorrow, everyone would know it. Sarah joined her at the window. How are you doing? Really? Ava touched the scarf covering her head. I'm angry, I'm violated, and I'm absolutely determined that what happened to me is going to be the last time Turner and Ellis hurt anyone. It will be, Sarah said quietly. I promise you, Ava. This is the case that ends them. That evening, Ava sat alone in her living room with a glass of wine she didn't drink and a television she didn't turn on. Her laptop was open on the coffee table, showing the preliminary draft of her recusal statement. It was thorough, professional, and devastating. She'd written it in the same measured tone she used for all her judicial opinions. No emotion, just facts. But those facts painted a picture that no defense attorney could blur. Wrongful arrest, procedural violations, deliberate humiliation, officers under investigation for the exact same pattern of abuse they'd inflicted on her, and at the center of it all, a recording that captured their contempt in their own words. Her phone buzzed. A text from Michael. Judge Hartman confirmed he'll take over the case. Wants to meet with you first thing Monday. Ava typed back. 8 a.m. My chambers. Another buzz. This one from Sarah. Justice Department approved emergency phone seizure. Feds are picking up Turner and Ellis first thing tomorrow morning. Additional charges filed 1 hour ago. Ava allowed herself a small, grim smile. She stood, walked to her bedroom, and removed the scarf. Looked at herself in the mirror once more. The damage was still there, raw, visible, undeniable. But something else was there too, something that hadn't been there yesterday. Power. Not the power of her robe or her gavel or her title, the power of someone who'd been knocked down and had chosen to rise with every weapon at her disposal. The power of documentation, of procedure, of a system that could be bent but not broken when someone knew exactly how to wield it. Tomorrow morning, Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis would wake up in their homes, maybe make coffee, maybe kiss their wives or girlfriends goodbye. They'd drive to work expecting another shift, another day of wielding authority without accountability, and then federal agents would be waiting. Ava touched her bare scalp one last time, felt the roughness of it, the vulnerability. And then she turned away from the mirror and went to bed. She slept better than she had in years. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and the promise of rain. Ava dressed carefully. A charcoal suit, white blouse, pearl earrings. The scarf, this time in deep blue, wrapped precisely around her head. She looked every inch the federal judge she was. Dignified, unshaken, ready. Judge Hartman was waiting in her chambers when she arrived, his expression grave. He was in his 60s, a veteran of the bench with a reputation for fairness and a deep impatience for procedural games. "Ava," he said, standing as she entered, "I don't even know where to begin." "Then let me," she said. She handed him a flash drive. "This contains the audio recording, my formal statement, and all supporting documentation. Sarah Reeves has already filed supplemental charges. The Justice Department is executing warrants as we speak." Hartman sat down heavily. "This is going to explode." "It already has. Marion Clark is holding a press conference at noon. I'll be there." "Ava, are you sure you don't have to—" "Yes," she said firmly. "I do, because if I don't, Turner and Ellis will control the narrative. They'll claim I'm hiding, that I'm biased, that this is revenge. But if I stand there and show exactly what they did, if I let the public see the evidence, then there's no narrative left for them to control. Just truth." Hartman studied her face. "You're one of the strongest people I know. I'm just someone who refuses to let cruelty win." At 9:15 that morning, federal agents arrested Marcus Turner in the parking lot of the county jail as he arrived for his shift. They arrested Daniel Ellis 10 minutes later as he sat in the break room eating a donut. Both men were handcuffed, read their rights, and led away in full view of their colleagues. By 9:30, every news outlet in the state had the story. By 10, it was national. And by 11, when Ava walked into the federal courthouse flanked by Sarah Reeves and Marion Clark, there were cameras everywhere. The steps of the federal courthouse had never felt so long. Ava climbed them with measured grace, cameras tracking every movement, reporters shouting questions that blurred into white noise. She kept her eyes forward, her expression calm, flanked by Sarah and Marion like bookends of federal authority. Behind them, Michael carried a briefcase containing copies of every document, every piece of evidence, every procedural violation that would soon become public record. The press conference was scheduled for the main hall, a soaring space with marble columns and enough room for the 100-plus reporters who descended on the courthouse like a storm. Ava could see them through the glass doors, jostling for position, setting up cameras, checking lights. The energy was electric, predatory, hungry for a story that wrote itself in headlines they were already composing. Marion paused just inside the doors, her hand on Ava's arm. "Last chance to change your mind. We can have Sarah do this alone. You don't have to put yourself through this." Ava looked at her steadily. "Yes, I do." "Why?" "Because silence is what protected them. Silence is what let Turner and Ellis brutalize people for 7 years. And silence is what they're counting on now, that I'll be too embarrassed, too traumatized, too afraid of the spotlight to tell the truth." She adjusted her scarf slightly. "I'm not giving them that gift." Marion nodded, something like respect flickering across her face. "Then let's make sure they never forget this day." They pushed through the doors into chaos. The noise was immediate and overwhelming, voices overlapping, cameras clicking, the shuffle of feet and rustle of notepads. Marion guided them to a podium set up at the front of the hall, flanked by the flags of the United States and the Department of Justice. Sarah took position on the left, Ava on the right, and Marion stepped up to the microphone. The room didn't quiet so much as focus, all that frantic energy suddenly channeled into a single point of attention. "Good morning," Marion began, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. "I'm Marion Clark, Deputy Director of Public Affairs for the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. I'm joined today by Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Reeves, who is prosecuting a significant civil rights case currently before the federal court, and by Judge Ava Brooks of the 7th District Court." A ripple went through the crowd. They knew Ava's name now, knew her face from the courthouse website, from legal journals, from a dozen public functions. But this was different. This was a judge standing not at the bench, but at the center of her own case, and the cognitive dissonance was palpable. "On Saturday morning," Marion continued, "Judge Brooks was arrested during a protest dispersal. She was not participating in the protest. She was jogging. She was caught in this crowd, identified herself, and complied with all lawful orders. Despite this, she was taken to county intake where she was processed and held for 14 hours. Marion paused, letting the timeline sink in. During that time, Judge Brooks was subjected to deliberate, systematic humiliation by two corrections officers who are currently under federal indictment for civil rights violations. These officers, Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis, did not know Judge Brooks' identity when they brutalized her. They thought she was just another inmate, someone powerless, someone who wouldn't fight back. Another pause. The cameras were trained on Ava now, zooming in on the scarf, on her face, on the careful composure that revealed nothing and everything. "They were wrong," Marion said quietly. This morning, Turner and Ellis were arrested on additional federal charges, including deprivation of rights under color of law, cruel and unusual punishment, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. These charges are supported by audio evidence, witness testimony, and surveillance footage that document not just what was done to Judge Brooks, but the pattern of abuse these officers have inflicted on countless others. Sarah stepped forward, unfolding a document. The original indictment against Turner and Ellis included 12 counts spanning 7 years of documented abuse. As of this morning, we have added 6 additional counts related to Saturday's incident. We are also reopening 17 previously closed complaints against these officers, and we have established a hotline for any additional victims to come forward. The reporters erupted with questions, voices colliding. What exactly did they do to Judge Brooks? Will she testify? Has she recused herself from their trial? Are there other officers involved? Marion held up a hand. The noise subsided, barely. "Judge Brooks has prepared a statement," Marion said, "and then we'll take questions." Ava stepped up to the podium. The microphone was too high. She adjusted it down with steady hands. Then she looked out at the sea of faces, the cameras, the recording devices held up like offerings. She thought about the women still in county holding, the ones who'd been shaved, stripped, humiliated, and had no recording, no platform, no voice loud enough to be heard over the machinery of indifference. "My name is Ava Brooks," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "For the past 8 years, I've served as a district court judge. I've presided over thousands of cases. I've sentenced people to prison, granted parole, ruled on constitutional questions, and done my best to ensure that justice, however imperfect, was served in my courtroom." She paused, gathering the words she'd practiced in her mirror that morning. "On Saturday, I experienced what it's like to be on the other side of that system, to be arrested without cause, held without explanation, and brutalized by people who wore badges and believed that badge gave them the right to strip away my dignity." The room was absolutely silent now. Officers Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis forced me into a room. They handcuffed me, and then, while laughing and recording with their phones, they shaved my head with electric clippers. Not because I was hiding contraband, not because I posed a security risk, but because they enjoyed it, because they could, because they believed I was powerless and would never have the ability to hold them accountable. Ava unwrapped the scarf. Let it fall to the podium. Cameras flashed like lightning. Her scalp was still raw, still uneven, still bearing the marks of careless violence. But she held her head high, let them see it all, let the evidence of what had been done speak louder than any words. "This is what they did," she said quietly. "To me, to a sitting judge. And if they did this to me, someone with resources, education, and institutional power, imagine what they've done to people who have none of those things. Imagine what they've done to the poor, the addicted, the mentally ill, the people who end up in county intake with no voice, no recording, no way to fight back." She rewrapped the scarf slowly, deliberately. "I have recused myself from their criminal trial. Judge Hartman will take over the proceedings. But I will testify as a witness. I will provide all evidence I gathered, and I will do everything in my power to ensure that what happened to me is the last time Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis are able to abuse their authority." She stepped back from the podium. The reporters exploded into questions again, but Ava didn't answer them. She simply stood there, flanked by federal prosecutors, and let the weight of institutional justice arrange itself around her like armor. Sarah fielded most of the questions, technical details about charges, timelines, procedures. Marion handled the broader implications: Department of Justice oversight, federal monitoring, potential systemic reforms. Ava spoke only twice more, once to confirm she had audio evidence, and once to say that she hoped other victims would come forward. When it was over, when the cameras finally stopped flashing and the reporters rushed off to file their stories, Ava walked out of the courthouse into gray daylight that felt almost peaceful. Her phone was already buzzing with messages, colleagues, friends, former clerks, law school classmates. She ignored them all except one. It was from Judge Hartman. "You did the right thing." That took more courage than most people will ever understand. Ava texted back, "It took what was necessary." By noon, the story was everywhere. Every news website, every social media platform, every cable news channel. The images of Ava removing her scarf had become iconic in a matter of hours. A symbol of vulnerability transformed into power, of victimization refused, of a system forced to confront its own brutality. The narrative wrote itself, but not in the way Turner and Ellis would have wanted. The story wasn't about a judge seeking revenge. It was about two officers so drunk on unchecked authority that they'd brutalized a sitting judge and documented their own crime. It was about a pattern of abuse so ingrained that they couldn't even recognize when they'd finally chosen the wrong victim. By that evening, the hashtag #Justice for Judge Brooks was trending nationally. But more importantly, the hotline Sarah had mentioned was ringing off the hook. Former inmates calling in, family members, witnesses, people who'd been too afraid to speak before but who saw in Ava's courage a permission slip for their own truth. Ava watched the coverage from her living room, her laptop open beside her, monitoring the legal filings as they populated the federal database in real time. Sarah had filed motions to preserve evidence from Turner's and Ellis's phones. The Justice Department had ordered a complete audit of the county intake facility. The state attorney general had announced an independent investigation. And most critically, 17 old complaints against Turner and Ellis had been unsealed and transferred to federal jurisdiction. Her phone rang. It was an unknown number with a local area code. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Judge Brooks?" The voice was female, young, shaking. "Yes? My name is Keisha Morgan. I was in county intake 2 years ago, and Officer Turner, Her voice broke. "He did the same thing to me. Shaved my head, made jokes. His partner filmed it, but when I tried to report it, they said I was lying. Said I'd assaulted an officer and the haircut was for safety. They added charges and kept me there for 6 weeks." Ava closed her eyes, her hand tightening on the phone. "Keisha, are you willing to give a formal statement to the federal prosecutors?" "I already called the hotline. They're sending someone tomorrow, but I needed to tell you thank you, because I thought I was crazy. I thought no one would ever believe me, and then I saw you on TV and She was crying now. "Thank you for not being afraid." "Keisha," Ava said gently, "I was terrified. But I had resources you didn't, and I'm going to make sure those resources are used to get justice for you and everyone else Turner and Ellis hurt. Do you understand? This isn't just about me. It's about all of you." "I understand," Keisha whispered. "I'll talk to the prosecutors. I'll tell them everything." "Good. And Keisha, you're not crazy. You were brutalized, and now they're going to pay for it." After she hung up, Ava sat in silence for a long time, the weight of responsibility settling over her like a second skin. This had become bigger than her own humiliation. It had become a reckoning. The next morning, Ava returned to her chambers to finalize her recusal and transfer the case file to Judge Hartman. She worked methodically, annotating every document, highlighting every piece of evidence, creating a roadmap that would make it impossible for any procedural error to derail the prosecution. Michael worked beside her, pulling exhibits, cross-referencing transcripts, preparing the formal recusal order. At 10:30, there was a knock on her door. Michael answered it, then turned to Ava with a strange expression. "Judge Brooks, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent." "Who?" "Officer Maria Rodriguez." Ava's jaw tightened. Rodriguez. The female officer who'd been in the room when Turner shaved her head. The one who'd stood there, frozen, and done nothing. "Send her in." Rodriguez entered like someone walking to her own sentencing. She was in civilian clothes, jeans, a simple blouse, and her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale. She stopped just inside the door, her hands clasped in front of her. "Judge Brooks, Her voice cracked. "I came to apologize. And to resign." Ava studied her for a long moment. Sit down. Rodriguez sat, didn't look up. Why did you do nothing? Ava asked quietly. Because I was afraid, Rodriguez whispered. Turner and Ellis, they run that facility. Everyone knows it. The supervisors, the administrators, everyone. They've been doing this for years and no one stops them because everyone's afraid of retaliation, afraid of being blackballed, afraid of... She finally looked up, tears streaming down her face. I'm not making excuses. What I didn't do, was unforgivable. But I want you to know that I've given a full statement to the federal investigators. Everything I've seen, everything I know, every incident I witnessed and didn't report. I'm cooperating completely. And your resignation? Effective immediately. I can't wear that uniform anymore. Not after what I let happen. Ava leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled. Officer Rodriguez, your resignation doesn't undo what happened, but your testimony might prevent it from happening to someone else. Sarah Reeves will need you to testify at trial. Will you do that? Yes, whatever they need. Even if it means testifying against colleagues, even if it means admitting your own complicity. Rodriguez nodded, her hands trembling. I watched them humiliate you. I watched them laugh about it. And I did nothing because I was too scared to stand up to them. That makes me complicit. And I have to live with that. But if my testimony helps put them away, then maybe that's something. It's not absolution, Ava said, but it's a start. Rodriguez stood, wiped her eyes. For what it's worth, Judge Brooks, you're the bravest person I've ever met. No, Ava said quietly. I'm just someone who had a recording device and enough institutional power to fight back. The brave ones are the people like Keisha Morgan who survived this without either of those things and are still willing to speak up. After Rodriguez left, Michael looked at Ava with something like awe. You didn't have to be kind to her. I wasn't being kind. I was being strategic. Her testimony is going to be critical. She's the inside witness who can confirm the pattern, the culture, the systematic nature of the abuse. And her willingness to resign and cooperate undermines any defense claim that this was just a few bad apples. Still, Michael said, you have every right to be angry. I am angry, Ava said. I'm furious. But anger isn't a strategy. Justice is. The preliminary hearing for the new charges against Turner and Ellis was scheduled for Thursday morning. Ava wasn't required to attend. She was now a witness, not a judge. But she went anyway, sitting in the gallery with Sarah and Marion, watching as Judge Hartman took the bench and the machinery of justice ground into motion. Turner and Ellis sat at the defense table looking smaller than they had in that intake room. Their lawyer, Keller, was a sharp man in an expensive suit, and he stood as Hartman called the hearing to order. Your Honor, Keller began, his voice smooth and practiced. The defense moves to dismiss all new charges on the grounds of judicial bias and entrapment. My clients had no knowledge that the alleged victim was a sitting judge, and her subsequent use of her position to pursue these charges represents a clear abuse of judicial authority. Mr. Keller, Hartman interrupted, his voice like steel. I've reviewed the evidence, all of it, and I'm going to save us all a great deal of time by telling you that your motion is denied. Judge Brooks's identity is irrelevant to the question of whether your clients violated her civil rights. They didn't humiliate a judge. They humiliated an inmate who happened to be a judge. The fact that she had the resources to document that humiliation and seek justice doesn't constitute bias. It constitutes evidence. Keller's jaw tightened. Your Honor, with respect, Mr. Keller, I've also reviewed the 17 reopened complaints against your clients. I've listened to Judge Brooks's recording. I've read Officer Rodriguez's statement, and I've seen the surveillance footage from the intake facility that corroborates every detail. So unless you have something substantive to argue beyond character assassination of the victim, I suggest you focus on preparing an actual defense. Turner leaned over, whispered something to Keller. Ellis stared straight ahead, his face ashen. Your Honor, Keller said tightly, we request bail pending trial. Denied. Given the nature of the charges, the pattern of abuse documented by federal investigators, and the risk of witness intimidation, the defendants will remain in federal custody until trial. Ava watched Turner's face go white, watched Ellis's hands curl into fists. They were beginning to understand now, beginning to realize that the woman they'd mocked and shaved and humiliated wasn't just fighting back, she was destroying them with the same system they'd weaponized for so long. As the marshals led Turner and Ellis away, Turner's eyes found Ava in the gallery. For just a moment, their gazes locked. She saw rage there, disbelief, and underneath it all, the first flicker of genuine fear. Ava held his stare, her expression calm and absolute. Then she looked away, dismissing him as completely as he'd tried to dismiss her. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting again. This time, Ava didn't stop to talk. She simply walked to her car, drove home, and sat in her quiet living room with a cup of tea and the knowledge that Phase 1 was complete. The arrest, the charges, the denial of bail, the systematic dismantling of any defense based on her identity rather than their actions. Now came the harder part. The trial, the testimony, the public examination of every moment of humiliation she'd endured. Her phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. 17 victims willing to testify. Rodriguez's statement is devastating. We're going to bury them. Ava texted back, good, because they buried dozens of people before me. It's time they understood what that feels like. Over the next 2 weeks, the case built momentum like an avalanche. More victims came forward, 32 in total, spanning Turner's and Ellis's entire careers. The surveillance footage from the intake facility was released to the court, showing not just what had happened to Ava, but a pattern of abuse so systematic it was almost bureaucratic in its execution. Financial records revealed that Turner and Ellis had been selling contraband to inmates, taking bribes to smuggle items in and out of the facility, and falsifying reports to cover their tracks. The web of corruption was vast, implicating supervisors who'd turned blind eyes, administrators who'd buried complaints, and a union that had protected them through a dozen internal investigations. Ava watched it all unfold from a distance, no longer the judge, but a witness preparing to testify. Sarah visited her chambers twice to prep her testimony, running through questions, reviewing the recording, making sure every detail was airtight. They're going to come at you hard, Sarah warned. Keller's going to try to paint you as vindictive, as someone who used her power to manufacture a case. Let him try, Ava said calmly. The recording speaks for itself, and so will the other 32 victims. He'll argue you orchestrated it, that you never turned off your recording app deliberately. I didn't even remember it was running, but even if I had, so what? Citizens have the right to record their own arrests. That's established law. He'll say you're too close to the case, that your testimony is tainted by personal vengeance. Ava smiled slightly. Sarah, I've been cross-examined by some of the best defense attorneys in the state. I've ruled on constitutional questions that made national news. I think I can handle Keller's theatrics. And she did. When the trial finally began on a cold Monday in late spring, Ava Brooks took the stand in Courtroom 7B, the same courtroom where she'd presided for 8 years, and told her story with the same measured precision she'd brought to every case she'd ever heard. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Every seat in the gallery filled, spectators standing along the back wall, reporters squeezed into every available space with notebooks and recording devices. The air hummed with anticipation so thick it was almost tangible. Ava had sat in this room hundreds of times, but never from the witness chair, never with every eye in the building trained on her, waiting to hear her speak not as a judge, but as a victim. She wore a navy suit, cream blouse, pearl earrings. Her hair had grown back slightly in the weeks since the arrest, maybe half an inch, enough to soften the starkness but not enough to hide what had been done. She'd chosen not to wear a scarf today. Let them see it. Let the jury see exactly what Turner and Ellis had taken from her. Judge Hartman sat on the bench looking grave and absolutely focused. The jury box held 12 faces ranging from skeptical to sympathetic to carefully neutral. And at the defense table sat Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis, both in dark suits that probably cost more than Ava's monthly mortgage payment, both staring at her with expressions that tried for confidence but couldn't quite mask the fear underneath. Their attorney, Keller, stood near the podium reviewing his notes. He was in his 50s, silver-haired, with the kind of polished charisma that came from decades of defending the indefensible. He'd made his career getting dirty cops acquitted, And he approached this case like every other: find the weakness, exploit it, and turn the victim into the villain. Sarah Reeves stood and approached Ava, her movements measured and professional. Please state your name for the record. Ava Marie Brooks. And what is your profession? I'm a district court judge for the 7th Circuit. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Everyone knew who she was by now, but hearing her say it in this context, as a witness rather than the authority figure, created a cognitive dissonance that settled over the room like fog. Judge Brooks, Sarah continued, can you tell the jury what happened on the morning of Saturday, April 13th? Ava took a breath, let it out slowly. Then she began. She told them about her morning run, about the protest she'd accidentally encountered, about trying to leave, about being swept into the crowd, about the officer who grabbed her arm without asking questions. She described the transport van, the holding cell, the hours of waiting with no explanation and no phone call. And then what happened? Sarah asked. I was taken to an intake processing room. 2 officers were waiting, Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis. Ava looked directly at them as she said their names. Neither man met her eyes. They told me I was going to be searched for contraband. Did you consent to this search? I requested that a female officer be present, which is standard procedure. They refused. When I insisted on proper protocol, Officer Turner became hostile. What did he say? Ava's voice remained steady, clinical. He said I didn't get to refuse, that I'd lost my rights when I was arrested, that in there I was just another body. Sarah nodded. What happened next? Officer Ellis left and returned with a female officer named Maria Rodriguez. I thought proper procedure was finally going to be followed, but instead of conducting a search, Officer Turner pulled out a pair of electric clippers. The jury shifted. Several members leaned forward. What did you think when you saw the clippers? I was confused, then frightened. I asked what he was doing. He said he was making sure I wasn't hiding anything. I told him that wasn't standard procedure. He laughed. Did you resist? I tried to stand up, to leave. Officer Ellis grabbed my arms and held me down while Officer Turner turned on the clippers. Sarah's voice softened slightly. Can you describe what happened next? Ava's hands tightened in her lap, but her voice didn't waver. Officer Turner pressed the clippers to my scalp and began shaving my head. I told him to stop. I told them both that they were making a serious mistake. Officer Turner asked if I was threatening him. I said it was a promise. They both laughed. How long did this take? Several minutes. Officer Turner took his time, made jokes while he did it. Officer Ellis filmed part of it with his phone. Officer Rodriguez stood by the door and said nothing. Did you ever tell them who you were? No? Why not? Ava met Sarah's eyes. Because in that moment, I realized something important. If I told them I was a judge, they might stop. They might panic and release me and try to cover it up. But they'd still be who they were, officers who abused their power whenever they thought no one was watching. So I stayed quiet. I let them reveal exactly who they were when they believed their victim was powerless. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah walked to the prosecution table and picked up a small device. Judge Brooks, did you have your phone with you during this incident? Yes, in the inner pocket of my running jacket. And was it recording? Yes. I have a habit of using the voice memo app during my runs to record thoughts about cases or reminders to myself. That morning, I'd started a recording before the protest. I never turned it off. Sarah held up the device. Your Honor, I'd like to play Exhibit 17 for the jury. This is the audio recording from Judge Brooks's phone, time-stamped and authenticated by federal forensic analysts. Hartman nodded. Proceed. The speakers crackled to life. And for the next 8 minutes, the entire courtroom listened to Ava's arrest, her processing, her calm requests for proper procedure. They heard Turner's contempt, Ellis's threats, Rodriguez's silence, and they heard the clippers, the mechanical buzz, the sound of hair falling, the laughter that punctuated each pass. When it ended, several jurors were staring at Turner and Ellis with undisguised disgust. One woman in the back row had tears streaming down her face. The courtroom felt smaller somehow, compressed by the weight of evidence so damning that no amount of legal maneuvering could soften it. Sarah turned back to Ava. After this incident, what did you do? I was returned to holding. I was released several hours later on my own recognizance. The charges were eventually dropped. I went home, backed up the recording to multiple secure locations, and on Sunday morning I contacted federal prosecutors and provided a complete statement. Why did you wait until Sunday? Because I needed to think carefully about what had happened and what it meant. I'm a sitting judge. If I came forward immediately in anger or distress, the defense could argue I was acting impulsively or vindictively. I wanted to approach this the same way I approach every case, with evidence, documentation, and a clear understanding of the legal implications. And what were those implications? That Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis had just done to me exactly what they've been accused of doing to dozens of other people. That their contempt for human dignity wasn't personal, it was systematic. And that if they could do this to a judge, imagine what they'd done to people with no power, no voice, no ability to fight back. Sarah nodded slowly. No further questions, Your Honor. Hartman looked to the defense table. Mr. Keller, your witness. Keller stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and approached Ava with the kind of practiced sympathy that defense attorneys perfect over decades. His voice was gentle, almost friendly. Judge Brooks, first let me say that what happened to you was clearly distressing. No one disputes that. Ava said nothing, just watched him with the same neutral expression she'd worn for years on the bench. But I do need to ask you some questions about the circumstances surrounding this incident. Is that all right? Of course. You said you were jogging that morning. Where exactly were you jogging? Through Riverside Park, along my usual route. And this route took you directly past a protest that had been widely publicized for weeks. Is that correct? I wasn't aware of the protest until I encountered it. Keller raised an eyebrow. You're a district court judge, said. Your job requires you to be aware of public events, civil disturbances, anything that might affect courthouse security or jury deliberations. And you expect this jury to believe you had no idea there was a major protest happening that morning? I don't follow social media, Mr. Keller. I don't watch morning news. I jog early on Saturdays precisely to avoid crowds. So, yes, I was unaware. How convenient, Sarah shot to her feet. Objection? Argumentative. Sustained, Hartman said sharply. Mr. Keller, ask questions. Don't editorialize. Keller nodded, not looking remotely chastened. Judge Brooks, you testified that you recorded the incident on your phone, but you also testified that you started that recording before the arrest, during your jog. Isn't that correct? Yes. So you were already recording when you allegedly stumbled into this protest. The recording was running, yes. I often record during my runs. Can you prove that? Can you show this jury other recordings from previous runs? Ava didn't hesitate. Yes. My phone contains dozens of voice memos from previous Saturdays, all time-stamped, all following the same pattern. Sarah has already entered them into evidence as Exhibit 43 through 68. Keller's jaw tightened slightly. How fortunate that you have such thorough documentation. I'm a judge, Mr. Keller. Documentation is what I do. Indeed it is, which brings me to my next question. You knew my clients, didn't you? You knew Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis were scheduled to appear before you on Monday morning. I knew their case was on my docket, yes. You'd reviewed their files? Read the charges against them? Extensively. And you'd already formed opinions about their guilt? Ava's expression didn't change. I'd reviewed the evidence presented by both the prosecution and defense. I had not made any determination of guilt. That's the jury's role, not mine. My role was to ensure a fair trial. But you had opinions. You must have. You're human, after all. I had reviewed evidence that suggested a pattern of abuse, but I had also reviewed the defense's counter-arguments. That's what judges do, Mr. Keller. We consider all sides before making any rulings. And yet here you are, testifying against my clients after being arrested in what you claim was a coincidence. It was a coincidence. Was it? Keller stepped closer, his voice dropping to something almost intimate. Or did you, a judge with extensive knowledge of legal procedure and criminal justice, deliberately put yourself in a position where you might encounter law enforcement? Did you, perhaps, hope to be arrested so you could gather evidence against officers you'd already decided were guilty? The gallery erupted in whispers. Sarah stood again, her voice sharp. Objection! Counsel is testifying, not questioning. There's absolutely no evidence to support this conspiracy theory. Hartman's gavel came down hard. Sustained. Mr. Keller, I'm warning you. One more insinuation without factual basis and I'll hold you in contempt. Ask legitimate questions or sit down. Keller took a step back, recalibrating. Judge Brooks, when my clients allegedly shaved your head, did you tell them you were a judge? No. Why not? I've already explained that. Yes, but let me make sure I understand. You allowed my clients to continue this alleged abuse because you wanted to catch them in the act. Is that correct? No, I stayed silent because telling them who I was would have stopped the abuse in that moment, but wouldn't have changed who they are. They would have simply chosen a different victim next time. So you made yourself a martyr. No, Mr. Keller. I made myself a witness. Keller paused, studying her. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock ticking on the back wall. Judge Brooks, you've been on the bench for 8 years. In that time, how many defendants have claimed they were mistreated by law enforcement? Dozens. And how many of those claims did you believe? Ava met his eyes steadily. Every claim is evaluated on its evidence, not on belief. Some had merit, others didn't. That's what trials are for. But now you're asking this jury to believe your claim, to take your word over my clients. Isn't that a double standard? No, I'm asking this jury to listen to the recording, to review the surveillance footage, to hear testimony from Officer Rodriguez, who was in the room, to consider the 17 other victims who've come forward with nearly identical stories. I'm not asking them to take my word. I'm asking them to examine evidence. Keller shifted tactics. You testified that my clients laughed while they shaved your head, that they filmed it with their phones. Correct. And you found this humiliating. Obviously. Traumatizing even. Yes. So traumatizing that you've spent the last 2 months coordinating with federal prosecutors to build a case against them. I've spent the last 2 months providing evidence for a case that was already built. The charges against your clients existed long before I was arrested. I'm simply one more victim in a pattern that was already documented. But you're not just one more victim, are you? You're the victim who has the power to destroy my clients' careers, their reputations, their freedom. You're the victim who can stand here in your tailored suit with your judicial authority and paint them as monsters while you play the martyr. Sarah was on her feet again. Your Honor, but Ava raised a hand slightly, her eyes still locked on Keller. Hartman noticed the gesture and nodded almost imperceptibly. Mr. Keller, Ava said quietly, your clients did paint themselves as monsters. They did it with their own words, their own actions, their own laughter. I didn't orchestrate what happened to me. I didn't plan to be arrested. I didn't ask to be humiliated. But when it happened, I did what any citizen should do. I documented it. I reported it, and I'm testifying about it. The only difference between me and the 32 other victims who will testify is that I had the resources and knowledge to fight back. That doesn't make me a martyr. It makes me fortunate. And it makes your clients exactly what the evidence shows them to be. Officers who abused their power for years and finally got caught. The gallery erupted in scattered applause. Hartman's gavel came down 3 times. Order! I will have order, or I will clear this courtroom. The noise subsided. Keller stood there for a moment, clearly trying to decide whether to press further or cut his losses. He chose the latter. No further questions. Redirect, Miss Reeves? Hartman asked. Sarah stood. Just one question, Your Honor. Judge Brooks, if you could go back to that Saturday morning, knowing what you know now, would you do anything differently? Ava thought about it. About the humiliation, the rage, the violation. About Keisha Morgan and the 17 other victims, and the dozens more who'd never come forward. About the system that had protected Turner and Ellis for so long because their victims didn't have power or platform or proof. No, she said finally. I wouldn't change a thing, because what happened to me is now part of the public record. It's evidence that can't be ignored or buried or explained away. And if my humiliation means that Turner and Ellis never hurt anyone else, then it was worth every second. Sarah nodded. Nothing further. Ava stepped down from the witness stand and returned to her seat in the gallery. As she passed the jury box, she saw several jurors watching her with expressions that ranged from sympathy to respect, to something that looked almost like awe. The trial continued for another 3 days. 32 victims testified, men and women, young and old, black and white, and Latino and Asian. Each told their story of abuse, humiliation, violence. Each described how Turner and Ellis had brutalized them, and then documented their complaints as lies or exaggerations, or attempts to avoid responsibility. Keisha Morgan took the stand and described being shaved just like Ava, her voice shaking but her resolve absolute. A man named David Chen testified about being beaten during intake and then charged with assaulting an officer. A woman named Patricia Williams described watching Turner plant drugs on her son and then laugh about it with Ellis in the hallway. Officer Rodriguez testified for 4 hours, describing the culture of impunity at county intake, the way complaints were buried, the systematic intimidation of anyone who spoke up. Her voice broke several times, but she didn't flinch from the truth. The surveillance footage was played, hours of it, showing Turner and Ellis brutalizing inmates with casual efficiency. The financial records were entered into evidence, showing thousands of dollars in unexplained deposits to their accounts. The falsified reports were laid out in excruciating detail, showing how they'd covered their tracks for years. Keller tried. He called character witnesses, fellow officers who swore Turner and Ellis were good men. He brought in a use-of-force expert who testified that their actions, while aggressive, were within policy guidelines. He argued that the inmates were criminals, that they'd assaulted officers first, that the entire prosecution was a witch hunt orchestrated by federal overreach and a vindictive judge. But every argument crumbled under the weight of evidence. The recording of Ava's humiliation played again and again, each time landing like a hammer blow. The testimony of 32 victims created a pattern so undeniable that no amount of character witnesses could offset it, and the surveillance footage, showing Turner and Ellis brutalizing people who were handcuffed, compliant, defenseless, destroyed any claim of self-defense. On the 4th day, closing arguments began. Sarah Reeves stood before the jury and laid out the case with surgical precision. She played key portions of Ava's recording. She reminded them of Keisha Morgan's testimony, David Chen's injuries, Patricia Williams's tears. She showed them the financial records, the falsified reports, the systematic cover-up. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "this case is not about Judge Ava Brooks. It's about 2 officers who believed they were above the law, who believed that a badge gave them the right to brutalize anyone they deemed powerless, who laughed while they stripped away human dignity and documented their own cruelty because they never thought they'd face consequences." She paused, looked at Turner and Ellis. They were wrong. Judge Brooks had a recording, but even if she hadn't, the evidence against these men is overwhelming. 32 victims, dozens of falsified reports, years of abuse. This isn't about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior so ingrained, so systematic, that they couldn't even stop themselves when they accidentally brutalized a sitting judge. She turned back to the jury. "The question you have to answer isn't whether Turner and Ellis are guilty. The evidence makes that undeniable. The question is what message you want to send. Do we live in a country where officers can abuse their authority without consequence? Where victims are ignored because they're poor or addicted or have criminal records? Or do we live in a country where justice applies to everyone, even officers who believe they're untouchable?" She let that question hang in the air. "You know the answer, and I trust you'll deliver it." Keller's closing was exactly what Ava expected: impassioned, theatrical, desperate. He painted Turner and Ellis as dedicated public servants betrayed by a system that demanded perfection. He argued that Judge Brooks had orchestrated her own arrest to manufacture evidence. He claimed the other victims were lying to get reduced sentences or settlements. But his voice lacked conviction, and when he sat down, Turner and Ellis looked smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of their own actions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreperson was a middle-aged black woman who'd sat in the front row taking meticulous notes throughout the trial. She stood when Hartman asked for the verdict, her voice clear and steady. "On count 1, deprivation of rights under color of law against Ava Brooks, we find the defendant Marcus Turner guilty." Ava's hands tightened in her lap. "On count 2, cruel and unusual punishment against Ava Brooks, We find the defendant Marcus Turner guilty. Turner's face went white. The foreperson continued through all 18 counts against Turner, guilty on every single one. Then she moved to Ellis. Guilty, guilty, guilty. All 16 counts. When she finished, the courtroom sat in stunned silence for exactly 3 seconds. Then applause erupted, scattered at first, then building into something that sounded almost like relief. Hartman's gavel came down. Order! I will have order! But even he couldn't completely suppress the smile that flickered across his face as the marshals moved to take Turner and Ellis into custody. Both men stood on shaking legs, their expensive suits suddenly looking like costumes. Ellis stared at the floor. Turner looked at Ava one last time, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief, and something that might have been regret if he were capable of it. Ava held his gaze until the marshals led him away. Then she closed her eyes and let herself breathe. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Reeves stood before a sea of cameras and microphones, Ava beside her, Marion Clark on the other side. The questions came fast and overlapping, but Sarah raised a hand and the noise subsided. Today, justice was served, Sarah said simply. 2 officers who abused their authority for years were held accountable. But this victory belongs to the victims, all 32 who had the courage to come forward and testify. This is their day. A reporter shouted, "Judge Brooks, how do you feel?" Ava stepped forward. She'd worn the burgundy scarf again today, wrapped elegantly around her head. But as she stood there in the afternoon sunlight, she reached up and unwrapped it, letting it fall into her hands. Her hair had grown back enough to show, short, uneven, but undeniably there. A symbol of resilience, of survival, of dignity that couldn't be permanently stripped away. "I feel," Ava said quietly, "like we've taken one small step toward a justice system that protects everyone, not just the powerful." Turner and Ellis will be sentenced in 6 weeks, but the real work begins now, reforming the systems that protected them for so long, supporting the victims they brutalized, and ensuring that no one else has to endure what we endured. Another reporter called out, "Will you return to the bench?" Ava smiled slightly. "Yes. As soon as the appeals process is complete and there's no conflict of interest. Because that's where I belong, ensuring that every person who enters my courtroom, whether defendant or victim, police officer or civilian, receives equal justice under law." She folded the scarf carefully, tucked it into her bag, and walked down the courthouse steps with her head held high. The 6 weeks between the guilty verdict and sentencing passed in a strange rhythm, part vindication, part exhaustion, part careful choreography of justice in motion. Ava returned to her chambers but didn't take the bench, spending her days reviewing case files, mentoring her clerks, and working with Sarah and Marion on the comprehensive reform package that had grown out of the trial. The media attention never fully subsided. Journalists still called requesting interviews. Legal scholars wrote articles analyzing the case's implications for qualified immunity and police accountability. Civil rights organizations held her up as a symbol of resistance, though Ava bristled at the hero worship. She hadn't chosen to become a symbol. She'd simply chosen not to stay silent. What mattered more than the headlines were the phone calls that came in waves, from victims she'd never met, from officers who wanted to report abuse they'd witnessed, from lawyers representing inmates who'd been brutalized and needed someone to believe them. Each call was a reminder that Turner and Ellis weren't anomalies. They were symptoms of a system that had failed spectacularly and repeatedly. Ava took every call she could, listened to stories that broke her heart, and reinforced her resolve in equal measure. She connected victims with Sarah's office, helped coordinate legal representation, and quietly funded several civil rights lawsuits through a discretionary account she'd established years ago. The money was hers, inheritance from her parents, carefully invested, and she couldn't think of a better use for it than ensuring that justice wasn't limited to people who could afford lawyers. On a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the verdict, Ava sat in her chambers reviewing depositions when Michael knocked softly on her door. "Judge Brooks? There's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." Ava looked up, noticed the careful way Michael was holding himself. "Who is it?" "Keisha Morgan." Ava set down her pen immediately. "Send her in." Keisha entered looking different than she had on the witness stand, less fragile somehow. Her hair had grown back fuller than Ava's, thick and natural, shaped into a short style that suited her face. She wore jeans and a sweater, carried a backpack slung over one shoulder, and her eyes were clearer than they'd been during her testimony. "Judge Brooks," she said, stopping just inside the door. "I hope this is okay. I know you're busy, but I needed to talk to you." "Of course," Ava said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. "Please, sit." Keisha sat, set her backpack on the floor, and took a deep breath. "I wanted to thank you, in person, for what you did. Keisha, I didn't do anything you and the other victims didn't do. You testified. You told your truth. That's what made the difference." "But you started it," Keisha said, her voice firm. "When I saw you on TV that first day, when you took off that scarf and showed everyone what they'd done, that's when I knew I could speak up. Because if a judge could stand there and admit she'd been humiliated, then maybe I could too. Maybe my story mattered." Ava felt something tighten in her chest. "Your story always mattered." "I didn't think so. Not before. I thought I was just another inmate who nobody cared about. Another complaint that would get buried. But you changed that." Keisha reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder. "I'm enrolled at community college now, starting in the fall. Criminal justice program." "Keisha, that's wonderful. I want to be a victim advocate. I want to help people like me. People who get caught in the system and don't know how to fight back. And I figured, if you could turn what happened to you into something that mattered, maybe I could too." Ava stood, walked around her desk, and did something she rarely did with anyone outside her immediate circle. She hugged Keisha, felt the younger woman's arms wrap around her, felt the way they both held on just a little too tight for just a little too long. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes. "You're going to be an incredible advocate," Ava said. "And if you ever need a reference, a recommendation, anything, you call me. Understood?" "Understood," Keisha whispered. She wiped her eyes, managed a smile. "I should let you get back to work." "Keisha, wait." Ava went to her desk, pulled out a business card, wrote her personal cell number on the back. "This is my direct line. Not my clerk, not my office. Me. If you ever need anything, legal advice, career guidance, or just someone to talk to, you use this number." Keisha took the card like it was something precious. "Thank you for everything." After she left, Ava sat at her desk for a long time, staring at the closed door. This was what justice looked like when it worked. Not just convictions and sentences, but transformation. Lives rebuilt, futures reclaimed, dignity restored one person at a time. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in late June. Ava arrived early, taking a seat in the gallery beside Sarah and Marion. The courtroom filled quickly, victims and their families, reporters, civil rights advocates, and a surprising number of law enforcement officers who'd come to witness what happened when the thin blue line finally broke. Turner and Ellis were led in wearing orange jumpsuits, their wrists shackled, their faces haggard from 6 weeks in federal custody. They'd experienced a taste of what their victims had endured, the humiliation of being processed, the loss of autonomy, the constant surveillance. Ava wondered if they'd learned anything from it, suspected they hadn't. Judge Hartman took the bench precisely at 9 o'clock, his expression grave. "We're here for sentencing in United States versus Marcus Turner and Daniel Ellis. Before I impose sentence, I'll hear from the victims who wish to speak, then from the defendants if they choose to make statements, and finally from counsel." The next 2 hours were among the most emotionally devastating Ava had ever witnessed. Victim after victim approached the podium and spoke directly to Turner and Ellis, describing in painful detail what had been done to them and how it had shattered their lives. Patricia Williams spoke about her son, who'd been released after Turner's planted drugs were exposed, but who'd spent 8 months in jail and lost his job, his apartment, his sense of safety. David Chen described permanent nerve damage in his arm from the beating Ellis had administered, how he couldn't hold his daughter anymore without pain. A woman named Sandra Lopez talked about being strip-searched in front of male officers while Turner filmed it on his phone, how she still couldn't be in rooms with men she didn't know without having panic attacks. When Keisha's turn came, she walked to the podium with her head high, looked directly at Turner, and spoke in a voice that didn't shake. "You shaved my head and laughed about it. You made me feel like I was nothing, like I was so worthless that even my dignity didn't matter. And then you filed a report saying I'd assaulted you, and that lie kept me in jail for 6 weeks. 6 weeks away from my daughter, who was 4 years old and didn't understand why mommy wasn't coming home. Turner stared at the table. Ellis's jaw was clenched so tight Ava could see the muscle jumping. But you know what? Keisha continued, her voice growing stronger. You didn't break me. You tried, but you failed, because I'm still here. I'm going to college. I'm going to help other people like me. And every day for the rest of your life, when you wake up in a cell, you're going to remember that the people you thought were powerless were strong enough to put you there. She walked back to her seat in the gallery, and the courtroom erupted in applause that Hartman didn't even try to stop. When it was finally Ava's turn, she stood and approached the podium without notes. She'd thought carefully about what she wanted to say, but in the end, it came down to something simple. Your Honor, I don't need to recount what happened to me. The jury has heard it. The record reflects it. But I want to address something that's become clear during this process. The culture that enabled Turner and Ellis to abuse their authority for so long. She turned slightly, addressing not just Hartman but the law enforcement officers scattered throughout the gallery. What happened to me and the other victims wasn't the result of two bad officers. It was the result of a system that prioritized protecting its own over protecting the people it's meant to serve. Supervisors who ignored complaints, administrators who buried evidence, a union that defended the indefensible, and good officers who stayed silent because they were afraid of retaliation. Several officers in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. But silence enables abuse, Ava continued, and complicity is just another form of corruption. If we want a justice system worthy of the name, we need officers who are willing to hold each other accountable. We need supervisors who investigate complaints instead of burying them. We need a culture where reporting abuse is seen as loyalty to the badge, not betrayal of it. She looked at Turner and Ellis directly. You two chose to abuse your power. You chose to humiliate people you thought were powerless. You chose to document your own crimes because you never believed you'd face consequences. And now you'll spend years in prison learning exactly what your victims already knew, that the system you weaponized is just as brutal when it's turned on you. She returned to her seat. The courtroom was silent except for the scratch of reporters' pens and the quiet weeping of several victims. Hartman gave Turner and Ellis the opportunity to speak. Ellis declined, staring at the floor. Turner stood, his lawyer beside him, and attempted what appeared to be an apology. Your Honor, I want to say that I'm sorry for my actions. I let the stress of the job affect my judgment. I made mistakes, and I take full responsibility. It was wooden, rehearsed, utterly unconvincing. Sarah rolled her eyes beside Ava. Several victims shook their heads. Hartman's expression didn't change. Mr. Turner, you're not sorry for your actions. You're sorry you got caught. There's a significant difference. Turner sat down abruptly. Keller made a final plea for leniency, arguing that his clients had served their community for years, that they had families, that prison time would ruin their lives. Hartman listened with visible impatience, then cut him off mid-sentence. Mr. Keller, your clients ruined dozens of lives over 7 years. They brutalized people in their custody, falsified reports to cover their crimes, and maintained a systematic pattern of abuse that represents one of the most egregious violations of civil rights I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. He opened the sentencing guidelines, though Ava suspected he'd already decided. Marcus Turner, please rise. Turner stood, his legs visibly shaking. On the count of deprivation of rights under color of law, I sentence you to 15 years in federal prison. On the count of cruel and unusual punishment, I sentence you to 12 years to run consecutively. On the remaining 16 counts, I sentence you to terms ranging from 8 to 12 years, all consecutive. Ava did the math quickly. Turner was looking at over a century in prison before parole eligibility. Daniel Ellis, please rise. Ellis stood, his face ashen. On your 16 counts, I sentence you to similar terms, totaling 92 years in federal prison. The gallery erupted. Victims embraced, tears flowing freely. Several officers in the back stood and walked out, their faces tight with anger or possibly shame. Hartman's gavel came down 3 times. Furthermore, I'm ordering both defendants to pay restitution to their victims in amounts to be determined at a later hearing. I'm recommending they be housed in facilities far from this jurisdiction to prevent any conflict with local law enforcement. And I'm forwarding my findings to the state bar for disciplinary action against any attorney who assisted in covering up their crimes." He looked at Turner and Ellis one final time. "Gentlemen, you took an oath to protect and serve. Instead, you brutalized and betrayed. You will spend the rest of your productive lives in prison, and you will do so knowing that the system you abused was ultimately strong enough to hold you accountable. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with finality. As the marshals led Turner and Ellis away, both men shuffling in their shackles, Ava felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not victory exactly, but closure. The weight that had settled on her shoulders that Saturday morning in the intake room lifted slightly, not completely, but enough to breathe easier. Outside the courthouse, the press conference was smaller this time, more focused. Sarah gave a brief statement about the importance of the sentences, the message they sent about accountability, the ongoing reforms that would prevent similar abuse. Marion announced that the Justice Department would be conducting comprehensive reviews of intake facilities nationwide, establishing new oversight mechanisms, and creating a federal database to track complaints against corrections officers. When it was Ava's turn to speak, she kept it brief. "Today's sentences don't undo the harm that was done. They don't give back the time victims lost, the dignity that was stripped away, the trauma that will take years to heal. But they do send a clear message, that abuse of authority will not be tolerated, that victims will be believed, and that justice, however delayed, will eventually arrive." A reporter called out, "Judge Brooks, will you return to the bench?" "I will," Ava said, "starting Monday, because that's where I can do the most good, ensuring that every person who enters my courtroom, regardless of their circumstances, receives fair treatment under the law." "Are you worried about retaliation from law enforcement?" Ava smiled slightly. "I've been worried about retaliation my entire career. As a black woman in the legal system, that's just the reality. But I refuse to let fear dictate my decisions. If we want a better system, someone has to be willing to hold it accountable. And I'm fortunate enough to be in a position to do that." She answered a few more questions, then excused herself and walked to where Keisha and several other victims were waiting. They formed a loose circle on the courthouse steps, united by shared trauma and hard-won justice. "What happens now?" Keisha asked. "Now," Ava said, "we rebuild. The three of you who are pursuing civil suits against the county, those cases move forward, and they'll likely settle given the criminal convictions. The reforms Marion mentioned will take months to implement, but they're already drafting legislation. And for all of us personally, we heal at whatever pace we need to." Patricia Williams spoke up, her voice still heavy with emotion. "Judge Brooks, I don't think I'll ever fully heal from what they did to my son, but at least now I can sleep at night knowing they can't hurt anyone else." "That's not nothing," Ava said gently. "That's everything." Over the following months, the reforms took shape with surprising speed. The county hired a new jail administrator who implemented comprehensive oversight protocols, installed additional cameras throughout the facility, and established an independent review board to investigate all complaints. 3 supervisors who'd buried complaints against Turner and Ellis were fired. The union that had protected them faced a federal investigation for obstruction of justice. More importantly, the culture began to shift. Officers who'd stayed silent about abuse started coming forward, reporting incidents they'd witnessed, cooperating with internal investigations. It wasn't universal. Plenty of officers still viewed the Turner-Ellis prosecutions as persecution rather than accountability, but enough changed that victims began to trust the system again, slowly and cautiously. Ava returned to the bench on a Monday morning in early July, walking into courtroom 7B for the first time in months. Her bailiff, a man named Raymond who'd worked with her for 6 years, stood as she entered chambers. "Welcome back, Judge Brooks," he said, his voice warm. "We missed you." "I miss being here," Ava replied. She touched the armrest of her chair, felt the familiar weight of the robe as she put it on. Her hair had grown to about 2 inches now, enough to style, enough to look intentional rather than traumatic. She'd chosen not to hide it. Let people see. Let them remember. Her first case back was a preliminary hearing for a man accused of assaulting a police officer during a traffic stop. The defendant was 23, black, scared out of his mind. His public defender argued that the officer had escalated the situation unnecessarily, that her client had acted in self-defense when the officer became physical. Ava listened carefully to both sides, reviewed the body cam footage, and made her ruling. The charges were reduced to resisting arrest, and she set reasonable bail over the prosecutor's objections. As the defendant was let out, he looked back at her with an expression of pure gratitude. That was what justice looked like. Not perfect, not always transformative, but fair, present, attentive to the humanity of everyone involved. 6 months after the sentencing, Ava received a letter from Turner. It arrived at her courthouse office, forwarded through several security checks, opened and screened by staff before it reached her desk. She almost didn't read it, almost threw it away unopened. But curiosity won out. The letter was short, written in careful block letters on prison stationery. Judge Brooks, I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to respond to this letter. But I needed to tell you that I understand now what I did to you and the others. I spent 7 years treating inmates like they weren't human, and now I'm an inmate myself. I know what it feels like to be powerless, to have your dignity stripped away, to be just a number in a system that doesn't care if you live or die. I can't take back what I did. But I want you to know I'm sorry, really sorry. Not because I got caught, but because I finally understand what I took from you, Marcus Turner. Ava read the letter twice, then filed it in her personal records. She didn't respond. Didn't know if she ever would. The apology felt genuine, but apologies didn't undo harm. They were just words, and words were cheap compared to the years of trauma Turner had inflicted. But she kept the letter anyway. Because transformation was possible, however rare. And because giving up on the possibility of redemption meant giving up on the entire project of justice. A year after her arrest, Ava stood in the same park where her ordeal had begun, preparing for her Saturday morning jog. The protest route was different now. City officials had created designated areas for demonstrations, implemented better crowd control procedures, established clearer protocols for arrests. Not perfect, but better. She stretched on the same bench where she'd paused that morning, feeling the familiar pull of muscles, the anticipation of movement. Her phone was in her pocket, voice memo app ready, but not yet recording. She wore the same running jacket, though she'd had it dry cleaned 3 times trying to erase the memory of that day. As she started running, she thought about everything that had changed. Turner and Ellis in federal prison, 32 victims receiving compensation and counseling, a county jail operating under federal oversight, new laws protecting inmates from abuse, officers who understood that accountability wasn't betrayal, but professionalism, and her own transformation, from judge to victim to witness to symbol to finally just Ava again. Running in the morning quiet with music in her ears and no weight on her shoulders except the responsibility she'd always carried. Her hair had grown back completely now, styled short and natural, gray streaks woven through black in a pattern that felt earned rather than aged. She'd thought about dyeing it, hiding the evidence of stress and trauma, but decided against it. The gray was part of her story now, part of what she'd survived. She ran past the fountain where the protest had erupted, now peaceful and empty except for a couple walking their dog. Ran past the intersection where she'd been arrested, where police cars no longer lined the streets in threatening formation. Ran through the quiet morning that belonged to her again, reclaimed from the memory of violation. When she returned home an hour later, sweating and satisfied, she found a package waiting on her doorstep. No return address, just her name printed carefully on the label. She carried it inside, opened it cautiously, and found a framed photograph. It was the image from the press conference. Ava removing her scarf, her bare scalp visible, her expression absolutely fierce. But someone had painted over it, transforming the photograph into a work of art. Her scalp was now adorned with intricate patterns in gold and silver, symbols of African royalty, sacred geometry, and resilience. The artist had turned her humiliation into a crown. A note was tucked inside. From all of us who were too afraid to speak up until you showed us how. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your truth. Thank you for teaching us that dignity cannot be taken, only temporarily hidden. It was signed by 17 names. Keisha Morgan's was first. Ava hung the portrait in her chambers, right behind her desk, where she could see it every day. A reminder of what was possible when victims refused to stay silent, when justice moved beyond theory into action. When the system, however imperfect, was forced to confront its own failures and do better. On a Tuesday evening in late autumn, Ava sat in her living room reviewing case files when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number from the Justice Department. Judge Brooks? This is Marion Clark. Marion, it's good to hear from you. I wanted to give you an update. The reforms we implemented after the Turner-Ellis case have now been adopted by 73 counties nationwide. Inmate abuse complaints are down 42% in facilities with the new oversight protocols. And we've successfully prosecuted 18 additional officers for civil rights violations, using your case as precedent. Ava felt something warm spread through her chest. That's incredible. It's because of you. Because you refused to let them get away with it. Because you documented everything, testified, and gave other victims the courage to come forward. Marion paused. I know this has been difficult. I know you never wanted to be the face of this movement, but I want you to understand what you accomplished. You didn't just get justice for yourself. You changed the system. I had help, Ava said. A lot of help. Of course you did, but you started it, and that matters. After they hung up, Ava sat in the quiet of her home, thinking about the year that had passed. The humiliation, the rage, the trial, the sentencing, the reforms. The women and men who'd found their voices because she'd found hers. The officers who'd learned that the badge didn't make them untouchable. The system that had bent, slowly and painfully, toward accountability. She thought about Turner and Ellis in their cells, experiencing every day what they'd inflicted on others. She didn't take joy in their suffering. That would make her no different than them. But she felt satisfied that justice had been served, that consequences had finally caught up to cruelty. Most of all, she thought about dignity, how easily it could be stripped away, how hard it was to reclaim, and how, in the end, it couldn't be truly destroyed because it existed not in what others did to you, but in how you chose to respond. They'd shaved her head, they'd mocked her, they'd tried to reduce her to nothing. But she'd stood up, testified, demanded accountability, and in doing so, she'd proven that dignity wasn't something fragile that could be taken with clippers and laughter. It was something fundamental that lived in the act of refusal, in the decision to fight back, in the insistence that human worth was non-negotiable. She touched her hair, thick and natural and gray-streaked and entirely hers. Then she stood, turned off the lights, and went to bed. Tomorrow she had a full docket, cases to hear, justice to administer, people who needed the system to work for them, not against them. And she would be there on the bench, in her robe, with her gavel, ensuring that every person who entered her courtroom was treated with the dignity she'd fought so hard to reclaim. The story didn't end with perfect healing or complete transformation. Trauma didn't work that way. But it ended with something better, with justice delivered, dignity restored, and a system forced to acknowledge that silence only protected abuse, while truth, however painful, created change. And in the quiet morning light of another Saturday, when Ava laced up her running shoes and stepped outside to jog through the same park where her ordeal had begun, she ran with her head high and her heart steady, knowing that every step forward was an act of reclamation. They'd tried to break her, they'd failed, and that failure had broken them instead, leaving in its wake a justice system just a little bit better than it had been before. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. And sometimes, in the slow work of creating a more just world, better was enough.